the mystery that nearly spelled the end for Miss Marple. Welcome back, dear friends, to another evening here at Warm Chapters. I'm your host Thomas, and I'm so glad you could be with us tonight. So settle in, make yourself at home, and let the story begin. Chapter 1. Soft Words Spoken Among the Roses. The last days of August in St Mary Mead possessed a quality which its inhabitants recognised instinctively, though few could have described it with any precision. The heat of summer had not quite departed, but it no longer pressed upon the village with that confident tyranny peculiar to July. The air had softened. It seemed to have grown reflective, as though the season itself had paused upon the threshold of change and was considering with some delicacy what must be relinquished. Along garden walls and cottage fences the roses still bloomed, though the first lavish outpouring of the year had long since passed. Their fragrance came now in gentler waves, less exuberant perhaps, but deeper and more memorable. One had the impression that they were offering up the last of their sweetness with a kind of dignified generosity. In such weather the whole village appeared to settle into a mood of comfortable recollection. Even the church clock striking the hour across the lanes seemed less an announcement than a reminder. Miss Jane Marple was very well acquainted with this particular mood. She had lived in St Mary Mead for a great many years, and the movements of the village were to her as familiar as the pattern of her own knitting, which, that afternoon, occupied her hands as she sat in the garden of Bramblewood Cottage. Her small house stood on the quieter side of the village lane, modest in its proportions, but kept with that exact and unostentatious care which said more about its owner than any display of grandeur could have done. The roses were Miss Marple's particular pride. A pale apricot climber spread itself along the east wall, and a deep crimson shrub rose, reliable almost to the point of virtue, bloomed near the path. Miss Marple appreciated reliability in roses, as she did in people. Both, in her experience, were much rarer than was generally supposed. She was not alone that afternoon. A small gathering had formed itself in the usual St Mary Mead fashion, without written invitation, without declared purpose, and yet with the perfect understanding that pleasant weather and pleasant company ought not to be wasted. Mrs. Dorothy Bantry, known to nearly everyone as Dolly, occupied the wicker chair to Miss Marple's left, a cup of tea balanced comfortably in her capable hands. Dolly Bantry was a large, warm-hearted woman of late middle age, with a direct manner and a laugh which always suggested that something had truly amused her, not merely provided a suitable occasion for laughter. She had been Miss Marple's closest friend for many years, and between them there existed that rare ease which comes only after long acquaintance and mutual trust. Nearby, standing rather than sitting, as was often her habit, was Mrs. Lydia Grant. Mrs. Grant was perhaps 50, though she carried herself with a composure that made speculation about numbers seem faintly impertinent. She was a handsome woman rather than a pretty one, with regular features, an upright bearing, and the kind of social grace that did not appear learned so much as practised into permanence. She had come to St Mary Mead some 6 years earlier, after the death of her husband, a solicitor of some standing, and had entered village life with quiet efficiency. She arranged flowers at the church, attended the reading circle with an appearance of sincere interest, and served on committees with a calm authority that others found both useful and slightly intimidating. Her opinion, once expressed, had a way of settling a matter rather than merely contributing to it. The fourth member of the little group was Miss Evelyn Pritchard, a spinster of uncertain age who lived near the post office, and whose chief occupation, as far as could be observed, was the careful monitoring of village life in all its particulars. Miss Pritchard was thin, quick-eyed, and possessed a memory for detail which she herself described as a burden, though others privately considered it something rather nearer to a weapon. She was not unkind, but she was precise. And precision, when applied to one's neighbours, is a quality that may be turned in a number of directions. The conversation had moved pleasantly through several subjects. the uncertain condition of Mr. Weatherby's vegetable garden, the question of whether the church fete should this year include a tombola, and the reported arrival of new residents at the old Ashford house on the Milchester Road. It was all very ordinary, very agreeable, and very much of St. Mary Mead. Then, quite imperceptibly, the atmosphere altered. It was not a silence exactly, nor was it a change of subject in the usual sense. It was rather like the faintest shift in the direction of a breeze, noticed only because a curtain moves where a moment before it had been still. It was Mrs. Grant who introduced the change. She did not do so abruptly. Mrs. Grant never did anything abruptly. She set down her cup with a pause so slight that only a person trained in small observations would have called it a pause at all. Then she said in a tone of reflective pleasantness, "I have been thinking lately about the question of confidence." Miss Pritchard looked up at once. Dolly Bantry, who had been admiring the crimson roses, continued to do so, though perhaps with rather less attention than before. Miss Marple's knitting needles moved without interruption. "In what sense?" Miss Pritchard asked. "Oh, in the most ordinary sense," Mrs. Grant replied, with a small, composed smile. "One shares things sometimes, things of a personal nature, with people one trusts, and generally speaking, that trust is well placed." She paused. "But occasionally," she continued, "only occasionally, one finds oneself wondering whether everything one has said has been held quite as carefully as one had hoped." She did not look at anyone in particular as she spoke. Her gaze rested upon the rose-bed before her, as if the matter were no more than a philosophical consideration inspired by late summer flowers. "It is an uncomfortable feeling," she went on, "not a certainty of any kind, merely a question. One notices, perhaps, a response from someone that suggests a familiarity with something one had not directly shared with that person, and one is left wondering." "It is most unpleasant," Miss Pritchard said, with the air of one who had examined the subject in detail and found it in need of condemnation. "The feeling of having offered a confidence, only to discover that one's confidence was not entirely held." "Quite," said Mrs. Grant. "Though of course one must be cautious about drawing conclusions. Misunderstandings occur. People piece things together sometimes without any breach of trust having actually taken place. It is important not to be uncharitable." "Very true," said Miss Pritchard. "And yet the feeling lingers, does it not?" Mrs. Grant gave a soft sigh. "It does," she admitted. "It does linger." A brief and harmonious silence followed. It was the sort of silence into which an idea may be placed, where it may settle without needing to be handled too openly. Miss Marple had not spoken since the conversation had shifted. She continued knitting the pale blue wool in her lap, some modest project or other which advanced by small degrees through the autumn months. She listened to the words, certainly, but she listened also to the spaces between them, which, in her experience, often contained the more reliable information. She was aware that Dolly Bantry had straightened very slightly in her chair. She was aware that Miss Pritchard's eyes had moved, briefly but unmistakably, in her direction. She was aware that Miss Pritchard's carefully neutral gaze had rested for the smallest fraction of a moment upon the knitting in Miss Marple's hands, before drifting back to the apricot roses. Miss Marple had lived in St. Mary Mead long enough, and had understood human nature well enough, to recognise precisely what was happening. No accusation had been made, no name had been mentioned, nothing had been said that was not courteous, plausible, and wholly deniable, and yet the implication had been introduced into the afternoon air as surely as the scent of the roses, and with considerably more intention. Someone, it was suggested, had been careless with a confidence. Someone could not quite be relied upon. Someone had perhaps taken private matters and allowed them, ever so gently, to pass into circulation. Miss Marple was not by temperament a woman given to alarm. She had seen too much of life for that. She had learned very thoroughly that the most dangerous moments were seldom those accompanied by raised voices or dramatic gestures. They were more often quiet. They came dressed as concern, as kindness, as ordinary conversation over tea. She completed a row of knitting and turned her work in her hands with unhurried care. "The roses have done particularly well this year," she remarked in the comfortable tone of one returning to a harmless subject. "I put it down to the dry spell in June. They always seem to benefit from a little hardship early on," Dolly Bantry responded with immediate warmth. "Yours are always magnificent, Jane. Mine have been absolutely beset by greenfly this season. I cannot think what I have done to deserve it." "Patience and sulphate of potash," Miss Marple said serenely. "One rarely goes far wrong with either." The conversation moved on. Mrs. Grant resumed her pleasant, well-judged manner. Miss Pritchard contributed 2 observations about the new residents at Ashford House. Dolly Bantry said something sensible about church committees and something less sensible about greenfly. The afternoon continued, outwardly, in exactly the same fashion as it had begun, but Miss Marple, as her needles clicked softly over the pale blue wool, was aware that something had entered the garden which had not been there before. Something quite small, something deliberate, something not kind. She thought of a young woman she'd once known many years ago, a gentle, bewildered creature who had been injured by just such a whisper. Not a public accusation, not even a proper rumour, merely a suggestion so faintly made that it could never be directly contradicted. The young woman had attempted at first to defend herself, but against what? Against whom? There had been no speaker, no statement, no charge, only a gradual alteration in manner, a little coolness here, a hesitation there, and finally the terrible knowledge that one's place among others had been subtly changed. Miss Marple had observed it carefully at the time. She had not forgotten. Village life, she reflected, was in many ways the most instructive study available to any person of an inquiring mind. It was not, as outsiders sometimes supposed, smaller than life elsewhere. It was merely more concentrated. The same passions, anxieties, vanities, loyalties, resentments, and complicated arrangements existed in any human community. But in a village, they were pressed into a scale where they became visible to anyone who looked closely and without romantic illusion. She glanced again at Mrs. Lydia Grant, who was now exchanging remarks with Miss Pritchard about the vicar's plans for the harvest festival. Mrs. Grant's profile was serene, agreeable, perfectly composed. Her hands, Miss Marple noticed, were very still indeed. It was only a detail, nothing more, a small thing, easily overlooked. But Miss Marple had built a considerable understanding of the world from exactly such small things, and she did not overlook it now. She tucked it away quietly, as one might set aside a fragment of wool that could prove useful in matching a pattern later on, and returned her attention to the apricot roses. They continued to bloom with their customary grace, entirely indifferent to the small human drama that had just begun, without fanfare and without certainty, among them. Chapter 2. The Vicar's Wife Chooses Her Words. The church of St. Catherine the Merciful stood at the far end of the village high street, separated from the surrounding lanes by a low stone wall of considerable age and a lych gate which leaned very slightly to the east. This inclination had been the subject of parish discussion for nearly a decade. It had produced 3 estimates, 2 subcommittee meetings, several strong opinions, and no practical improvement whatsoever. The churchyard beyond was well kept. The grass was trimmed around the older headstones, some of which leaned under the weight of names almost worn away by weather and time. The path from the lych gate to the porch was bordered in autumn by the small red berries of a cotoneaster which had been growing along the wall for longer than anyone living could clearly remember. Miss Marple was fond of St. Catherine's. She had attended services there for more years than she cared to count, and the building had acquired for her that particular quality of familiarity, which transforms mere architecture into something almost companionable. She knew the exact creak of the 3rd pew from the front on the left-hand side. She knew how the afternoon light came through the south window in October, casting a pale amber patch across the stone floor near the font. She knew the vicar's habit of clearing his throat before a difficult passage, and the organist's unfortunate tendency to accelerate during the final verses of longer hymns. These were the textures of a place thoroughly known, and Miss Marple found comfort in them. The vicar himself, the Reverend Arthur Clement, had served St. Catherine's for some 15 years and was regarded by his parishioners with that mixture of affectionate tolerance and modest respect which a conscientious country clergyman tends to inspire. He was tall, slightly stooped at the shoulders, and wore an expression of perpetual mild concern. Not, Miss Marple thought, because he was more anxious than other people, but because his face had been naturally arranged for serious reflection. He was a decent man. Miss Marple liked him. His wife was another matter, though not in any disagreeable sense. Mrs. Elena Clement was a compact, energetic woman of perhaps 45, with neat brown hair, quick brown eyes, and the administrative vigour of a person who had long ago concluded that the parish would not run itself, and had adjusted her life accordingly. She organised the flower rota, managed correspondence for the Church Restoration Fund, kept several committees from collapsing into vagueness, and possessed a memory for parish obligations which made forgetfulness in others almost impossible. She was not malicious. Miss Marple was quite sure of that. But she was one of those women in whom the desire to be helpful and the desire to be informed had become so closely intertwined that even Mrs. Clement herself might not always have known where one ended and the other began. It was on the Tuesday following the afternoon gathering at Bramblewood Cottage that Mrs. Clement called on Miss Weatherby, the unmarried sister of the same Mr. Weatherby, whose vegetable garden had lately been the object of neighbourhood sympathy, and found Miss Marple already seated in the front parlour over a cup of tea. Miss Agnes Weatherby was a comfortable, pink-cheeked woman of 60, who kept a good fire, baked excellent shortbread, and found one of the life's chief pleasures in conversation. She welcomed visitors with unreserved delight, and maintained no severe hierarchy among subjects. The state of the lane, the character of a neighbour, the progress of a mild complaint, the quality of the butcher's lamb, all were received by Miss Weatherby with equal animation. Miss Marple had always found her company soothing, rather like a warm room on a cold afternoon. One need not contribute a great deal, and the atmosphere was invariably pleasant. Mrs. Clement arrived at 3 o'clock with a tin of homemade biscuits and the particular brightness of expression, which indicated that she had something on her mind and had not come merely to exchange civilities. She greeted Miss Marple with genuine warmth, and settled herself into the armchair opposite, with the air of one who had been looking forward to precisely this arrangement. The first quarter of an hour passed agreeably. Mrs. Clement had opinions about the Harvest Festival decorations, a report on her husband's negotiations with the Roof Restoration Committee, and a small anecdote about her nephew's first term at his new school, which was genuinely amusing and needed no embellishment. Miss Weatherby contributed several observations of her own, and Miss Marple listened with the comfortable attentiveness of someone entirely content where she was. It was only when Miss Weatherby rose and stepped out to fetch a fresh pot of tea that something in Mrs. Clement's manner altered. Again, it was slight. Miss Marple, however, had long ago learned that important things often announce themselves by the smallest alterations. Mrs. Clement did not speak immediately. She smoothed the edge of her skirt with one hand and looked at the fire with an expression that had taken on a faint quality of regret. It was carefully composed regret, the sort worn by a person who has decided to say something difficult and has practised, perhaps more than once, the manner in which it ought to be said. "I have been meaning," she began, when the sound of Miss Weatherby's footsteps had receded towards the kitchen, "to have a quiet word." Miss Marple set down her cup with great precision. She did not answer. "It is nothing definite," Mrs. Clement said quickly. "Please do not imagine that I am suggesting anything of the kind. It is simply that one hears things from time to time, and one feels a certain responsibility when one is fond of people." "That is very considerate," Miss Marple said pleasantly. Mrs. Clement glanced at her. For the briefest instant she looked uncertain, as though she had expected a different response, and was not entirely sure how to proceed without it. Then she continued, in the same tone of gentle regret, There is a feeling, quite generally I think, that perhaps some things which have been shared in confidence have found their way a little further than was intended." She paused. "No one is suggesting deliberate indiscretion, of course. One understands how easily these things happen. A remark made in one context, overheard or repeated in another. It is the most natural thing in the world, and no one would think the worst of anyone for it." Another pause. "Provided it was understood and perhaps gently addressed." "I see," said Miss Marple. "I do hope you understand that I speak entirely as a friend." "I am sure you do," Miss Marple agreed. There was a brief silence. The fire settled in the grate with a small, comfortable sound. Somewhere in the house, Miss Weatherby could be heard setting cups upon a tray. "It is an awkward matter to raise," Mrs. Clement said, with the air of someone confirming a point already made sufficiently clear. "Most awkward," Miss Marple said sympathetically, "and yet you have managed it very gracefully." Mrs. Clement looked at her again. This time her expression was a little harder to read. There was something in Miss Marple's voice, not irony precisely, and certainly nothing so direct as challenge, which introduced a moment of instability into the conversation. It was rather like placing one's foot upon a step one had assumed to be stone, and finding, too late, that it was only soft earth. Mrs. Clement recovered herself almost at once. "You're too kind," she said, and smiled with considerable warmth. Miss Weatherby returned with the teapot, and the conversation resumed its earlier pleasant character. The biscuits were declared excellent. Mrs. Clement had, it transpired, a second anecdote about the same nephew, almost as diverting as the first. Miss Weatherby had heard an entirely different account of the proposed alterations to the Milchester Road, and the three ladies spent a comfortable 10 minutes establishing that both accounts were probably incomplete. Miss Marple contributed her share to all of it with perfect equanimity. But she was thinking. She was thinking with that particular concentration she reserved for matters which presented themselves as casual while being nothing of the kind. Several points had already arranged themselves neatly in her mind. First, Mrs. Clement had chosen her moment with care. The interval between Miss Weatherby's departure and return had been long enough for a delicate remark to be made and a response collected, but not long enough for serious examination. Second, Mrs. Clement had spoken of a general feeling. It was an extremely useful phrase. A general feeling could not be traced to a speaker. It could not be contradicted by evidence. It possessed neither shape nor address, and therefore could not be properly answered. Third, the remark had been presented in the spirit of friendship. That too was useful. It placed any displeasure on Miss Marple's part in the awkward position of seeming ungracious. To object too strongly would be to reject kindness. To ask too many questions would be to appear defensive. To say nothing would permit the suggestion to remain. It was, Miss Marple reflected, really very competently done. She thought of Mrs. Lydia Grant. She thought of the afternoon among the roses. She thought of a particular kind of social transaction, quiet, polite, and almost invisible, in which one person supplies a suggestion to another, and that second person, trusting the first, carries it forward. The original voice need never speak again. The idea acquires its own motion. It travels on the goodwill of others. It is repeated by people who do not know they have been given a task they did not choose. Mrs. Clement, Miss Marple was reasonably certain, believed every word she had said. She had received something from Mrs. Grant, not an accusation, perhaps, but a confidence, an implication, a carefully shaped anxiety, and she had translated it, in the conscientious manner of a well-meaning woman, into an act of friendship. If questioned, Mrs. Clement would not be able to say exactly what concerned her. She would say it was merely a general impression. She would insist she was sure it was nothing. She would explain, with perfect sincerity, that she had spoken only because she cared. And that, Miss Marple thought, was perhaps the most interesting part. She had encountered deliberate cruelty before. She had encountered careless harm. She had encountered the damage done by people who knew perfectly well what they were doing and did it anyway. But she had also encountered, Perhaps more often than any of the others, the quiet and effective harm carried out by people who sincerely believed themselves to be acting from the best of motives. They carried a small flame without knowing it. They passed it from hand to hand, and presently something was burning which no one admitted to having set alight. The thought was not comforting. It was, however, instructive. Miss Marple accepted another biscuit with every appearance of contentment, and complimented Miss Weatherby on the shortbread, which was in truth excellent. She listened with genuine interest to the unresolved question of the Milchester Road, and remained until the clock on the mantelpiece indicated that it was nearly 5, and that she ought, if she intended to be home before the light failed entirely, to make her way back along the lane. She said her farewells warmly. She thanked Mrs. Clement for the pleasant company and Miss Weatherby for the most welcome tea. She put on her coat and gloves and stepped out into the early autumn afternoon. The day had cooled in the past hour. The sky was pale grey above the copper beeches at the end of the lane, and a faint dampness had entered the air. Miss Marple walked home at her usual unhurried pace, and as she walked, she thought carefully. No accusation had been made. No name had been mentioned. Not once in either conversation had anything been said plainly enough to confront. And yet the idea was moving through the village now, quiet and inevitable as the tide coming in over sand. The idea that Miss Marple, so long trusted, so long regarded as the safe repository of half the village's confidences, could not, in the end, be entirely relied upon. At her gate, Miss Marple paused. The apricot roses were still holding their last few blooms against the cooler weather with admirable persistence. Reliability, she thought again, in roses and in people. Then she went inside to make her own tea and to consider what precisely she intended to do. Chapter 3. A purse gone missing at the service. The first Sunday of September came to St. Mary Mead with that particular freshness which early autumn grants to mornings that have not yet decided whether they belong to summer or to the season that follows. The sky was a clean, pale blue, with only the faintest wash of cloud near the horizon. The hedges along Church Lane were still thick with leaf, but here and there, at the very edges, one could already detect the first quiet suggestions of change. A yellowing tip, a rusty margin, a single leaf turned before its companions. The air possessed a lightness, scrubbed and faintly sharp, that made the walk to church feel less like a duty than a small privilege. Miss Marple set out from Bramblewood Cottage at her usual time. Her usual time was, in this instance, 20 minutes before the service, which allowed for a measured pace along the lane, a pause at the Lich Gate to exchange a word or two with whoever happened to be arriving, and several minutes in her pew before the organ began. She carried her prayer book in its customary leather cover, and wore her grey coat with the second button replaced. The original button had been lost in the spring. The replacement was a very good match, though not a perfect one, and the distinction mattered to Miss Marple rather more than it would have mattered to most people. A thing nearly right, she had often observed, could be more noticeable than a thing frankly wrong. The congregation at St. Catherine's that Sunday was of its usual size, sufficient to fill the front 2/3 of the nave with comfortable respectability, while the rear pews remained in their habitual and dignified vacancy. Miss Marple took her accustomed place in the third pew from the front on the left-hand side. It afforded her an unobstructed view of the pulpit, and, without any need to turn her head conspicuously, a satisfactory portion of the congregation. This arrangement had been arrived at gradually over many years, and was, in her opinion, entirely satisfactory. She noted the usual company as she settled herself. Mr. Clement stood near the vestry door, consulting with the organist about something which appeared to require more negotiation than music generally ought to require. Mrs. Clement sat with the upright composure of a clergyman's wife, who was both supporting her husband and conducting at the same time a private assessment of the floral arrangements. Miss Pritchard occupied her usual position 2 rows behind and slightly to the right, near enough to observe, far enough away to preserve an air of uninvolvement. Mrs. Lydia Grant arrived a minute or two later with her customary composure. She was accompanied by a woman whom Miss Marple did not immediately recognise. a visitor perhaps, or a relative. She was well dressed, perhaps 40, with a face that would not have been easily remembered after a first meeting, and the manner of someone accustomed to being a guest rather than a resident. The two women took their seats in the pew ahead of Miss Marple and slightly to the right, near the end closest to the centre aisle. As Mrs. Grant settled herself, she placed her handbag and a small flat purse on the pew beside her. Then, after arranging her gloves and prayer book, she moved the handbag to her lap and left the purse where it lay. Miss Marple observed this, not with suspicion, but with the unconscious attentiveness with which she observed nearly everything. Then she lowered her gaze to the order of service. The service itself proceeded in the manner to which she was accustomed. Mr. Clement delivered a sermon on charitable judgment with complete sincerity, though his reasoning wandered once or twice into regions from which it returned by a somewhat indirect route. The organist maintained admirable steadiness during the first two hymns, and only slightly exceeded the proper tempo during the third. The reading was from the epistles, and Mrs. Clement's flowers, chrysanthemums in cream and bronze, added a pleasing warmth to the chancel. Outwardly, nothing could have been more peaceful. Yet Miss Marple found, as the service progressed, that a very small part of her mind remained detached. It was not that she expected anything in particular to happen. Expectation, she had found, was sometimes a dangerous thing. It encouraged one to see what one had already imagined. But she was alert. There is a difference between alertness and expectation, though the two are often confused by those who possess neither. At the conclusion of the service, the congregation dispersed in the manner of village congregations everywhere, that is to say, very slowly. Conversational clusters formed along the aisle, in the porch, and upon the path beyond, so that the business of actually leaving church occupied considerably more time than the service itself had required. It was during this slow dispersal that the small purse became an object of interest. Mrs. Grant, gathering her belongings at the end of the service, reached for the purse and found that it was not where she had left it. She looked once, then again, with the faint frown of a woman whose certainty about a small matter has been unexpectedly disturbed. She lifted her prayer book, checked beneath the order of service, and glanced along the pew in both directions. Then her expression changed, not dramatically. Mrs. Grant was not a woman given to visible agitation, but concern entered her face with a controlled precision, as though it had been admitted only after passing inspection. "Is something the matter?" her companion asked quietly. "My purse," Mrs. Grant said. "I placed it here. I'm quite sure of it." She looked again, and this time her gaze moved, not along the pew, but behind it. Miss Marple, who was still gathering her own things, met that gaze very briefly. It lasted less than a second, but Miss Marple noticed it. The purse was eventually recovered some minutes later from the pew behind, where it had apparently slipped between the hymn book holder and the seat. Miss Pritchard was the one who noticed it, and she did so with no outward sign of triumph, though Miss Marple would not have said that triumph was entirely absent from the occasion. Mrs. Grant retrieved the purse with a brief expression of relief, opened it just enough to assure herself that its contents were undisturbed, and thanked Miss Pritchard with composed gratitude. The matter appeared to be entirely settled. Most of those present had not noticed it at all. Those who had noticed it were already engaged in other conversations by the time they reached the porch. A misplaced purse in church was not, after all, a matter of great consequence. Such things happened. Purses slipped, books fell, gloves vanished and were discovered under pew cushions. Human life was composed largely of misplaced small objects and the mild inconvenience they caused. And yet, within the hour, something had shifted. Miss Marple became aware of it not through any single remark, but in the gradual accumulated manner by which she generally became aware of significant things. A look held slightly too long by Mrs. Harding, who kept the draper's shop and was not naturally given to prolonged observation. A pause in Mrs. Clement's conversation as Miss Marple passed her on the path. Not an unfriendly pause, but a considered one, as though Mrs. Clement were momentarily uncertain which of two possible manners she ought to adopt. Miss Pritchard, falling into step beside Miss Marple for the first 30 yards of Church Lane, spoke pleasantly about the sermon and the weather, but there was in her eye a suppressed brightness. Miss Marple associated with a person who had recently acquired information and was enjoying the private possession of it. None of these things, taken separately, amounted to anything one could have named. Together they suggested that an idea had entered circulation, which had not been there before the service began. The nature of the idea was not difficult to deduce. Miss Marple walked home with her usual deliberation and turned the matter over carefully in her mind. The purse had contained personal notes. She was nearly certain of it. She had seen the edge of a folded paper when Mrs. Grant had opened it briefly earlier in the service to retrieve a handkerchief. It had been only a glimpse, a second, no more, but enough to establish that there was something written inside which was neither currency nor the ordinary kind of card carried for practical purposes. Something private, in other words. Something which, if seen by another person, might be a matter of concern. Miss Marple had not looked into the purse. She had not touched it. She had been seated behind Mrs. Grant, and her view of the object had been limited to what was visible from that position. During most of the service she had attended to the service, but she had been near enough. That, she understood, was the operative detail. Not what had happened, but what might be suggested to have happened. The purse had moved. Most probably it had simply slipped, as things do slip on polished wooden surfaces. But Miss Marple had been seated in the most convenient position to have caused that movement, or to have made use of it. No one would say she had opened the purse. No one needed to say it. Proximity was enough, especially after the prior impression had already been so carefully prepared. It was, she reflected, really rather elegant in its way. The incident itself, she thought, had not necessarily been arranged. In fact, she was almost certain that it had not been arranged in any ordinary sense. The purse had most likely moved by accident. But accidents, in the presence of a pre-existing suspicion, acquire a significance they would never possess on their own. A mind prepared to think a certain thing will discover evidence for it in places where an unprepared mind would find nothing at all. That was the dangerous part. Not the purse, not even the glance, the preparation. She remembered a case she had once heard of many years earlier, in quite different circumstances, where a man had been suspected of a theft for no better reason than that he had been in the room when the object disappeared. The alternative explanation had been perfectly simple, almost obvious in retrospect, but it had not occurred to anyone at the time because the easier explanation was already waiting to be believed. The easier explanation has a great deal to recommend it to those who wish to accept it. It requires so little effort. Miss Marple reached her gate and stood for a moment in the lane, looking at nothing in particular. The question she was turning over was not merely what had been said. By now she was reasonably certain of the general outline of what was being said, and she was beginning to form an opinion as to why. The more immediate question concerned method. Not her own method, the method of the thing itself. So far it had proceeded with a notable absence of any single, identifiable act of malice. A remark among roses, a careful word in a parlour, a purse misplaced during service. Each incident on its own could be dismissed as trivial. Each one left no firm surface upon which objection might rest. And that, Miss Marple recognised, was the particular cleverness of it. One could not refute an implication. One could not defend oneself against a suggestion that had never been made plainly. A direct denial might accomplish nothing except to make the denier appear anxious, and anxiety in such cases was often treated as a form of confirmation. Miss Marple opened her gate, walked up the path and went indoors. She would think about it more carefully over luncheon. She had found, over a long life, that patient thought was generally more useful than urgent action. A great many situations which presented themselves as urgent became, under examination, merely unpleasant. There was, however, one thing she intended to keep firmly in mind. When Mrs. Grant had looked behind her, searching for the purse, her expression had not been simply that of a woman checking whether something had slipped. There had been something else in it. Not surprise, not quite relief. Something that looked, to a person accustomed to reading such things, remarkably like confirmation, as though she had already known where to look. Chapter 4. The Sugar Tongs, Not Where They Belong. There existed in St. Mary Mead a long-established custom, neither formally arranged nor ever openly discussed, by which certain houses could be relied upon to be receptive to visitors on certain afternoons. It was not quite the same as keeping an at-home day. That more structured practice belonged to an earlier generation and had faded, along with much else, in the years following the war. What remained was less formal, but no less dependable, an understanding built up by repetition, observation, and the quiet laws of village life. Mrs. Harrington Doyle would usually be found at her sitting-room window on Wednesday afternoons. Miss Pritchard's door was answered with particular readiness on Thursdays, and Mrs. Fenton, who occupied the converted schoolmaster's house at the top of Vicarage Lane, could generally be counted upon for tea on almost any afternoon, provided one arrived before 4 and left before the light had gone. It was to Mrs. Fenton's house that a small company found its way on the Wednesday following the Sunday service, in the natural and apparently unplanned manner of such things. Mrs. Harrington Doyle had herself suggested it during a brief conversation outside the post office that morning, with the easy confidence of a woman accustomed to having her suggestions accepted. Mrs. Fenton, informed by telephone some 2 hours later, had agreed with her usual amplitude of spirit. By 3 o'clock, 5 women were arranged in Mrs. Fenton's sitting room with cups of tea and a quantity of small cakes, which spoke very well of Mrs. Fenton's relationship with her kitchen. Mrs. Fenton was a broad, comfortable woman, of perhaps 62, with grey hair, arranged without great ceremony, and hands that were always doing something. At present, they were passing the milk jug, then offering a plate of lemon sponge with an air of benevolent distribution. She had lived in the schoolmaster's house for 30 years, and had accumulated in that time a warmth of community feeling which expressed itself chiefly in inexhaustible interest in the welfare of others. She was not a gossip in the harsher sense. She did not repeat things in order to wound, and she was genuinely pained by misfortune. But she was interested, very interested. An interest, however kindly meant, is sometimes quite as useful to mischief as malice itself. Miss Marple was among the company. She'd encountered Mrs. Harrington Doyle outside the post office at the relevant moment, and had accepted the suggestion of tea at Mrs. Fenton's with every appearance of pleasure, which was entirely sincere. She liked Mrs. Fenton, she liked lemon sponge, and she had, besides, a particular reason that afternoon for wishing to be in the company of several people at once. She wished to observe. The other members of the party were Mrs. Clement, who had arrived slightly before Miss Marple, and Mrs. Lydia Grant, who arrived slightly after. Mrs. Grant greeted each person in the room with her customary composed warmth, including Miss Marple, whom she met with a smile of genuine seeming pleasure and a brief, pleasant inquiry after her garden. There was also Miss Pritchard, who had, it transpired, been passing the end of Vicarage Lane at precisely the right moment to be warmly included. In St. Mary Mead, passing at precisely the right moment was sometimes a matter of chance and sometimes a matter of vocation. The afternoon proceeded on its surface in an entirely agreeable fashion. Conversation moved through the usual channels: the harvest festival, the state of the Milchester Road, and the new residents at Ashford House, about whom information had now become more detailed. There was, it seemed, a husband in the financial line, and 2 children of school age. Mrs. Harrington Doyle, a tall, handsome woman of imperious habit and considerable social confidence, had a view of the new arrivals, which she expressed with the brevity of someone who considered elaboration unnecessary. "They will either settle in," she said, "or they will not." No one could deny the wisdom of this. Miss Marple listened, contributed where appropriate, and watched. It was during a momentary rearrangement of the tea-table that she noticed the sugar tongs, Mrs. Fenton had risen to fetch a second pot of tea. Mrs. Harrington Doyle shifted the cake stand to a more accessible position. There was the usual small movement among the group. Cups lifted, saucers adjusted, chairs drawn back an inch or two, polite apologies offered where none were required. The sugar tongs were silver, of modest size, and had been placed when tea was first laid in their proper position across the lip of the sugar bowl, with the grip end resting within. This was where one expected sugar tongs to be, and where one therefore ceased to notice them. Correctly placed objects have a way of becoming invisible. When the movement around the table settled, the tongs were no longer there. They had not been moved far, they had not been moved conspicuously. They lay now on the tray cloth beside the bowl, as though set down by someone who had used them and replaced them carelessly. It was the smallest of displacements. On any ordinary afternoon, in any ordinary setting, it would have attracted no attention at all. But this was not, Miss Marple had been reminding herself with increasing regularity, an entirely ordinary situation. She observed carefully without moving her gaze in any direction that might be interpreted as searching the faces around her. Mrs. Fenton was pouring from the fresh pot and attending to that duty with complete concentration. Mrs. Clement was engaged in a conversation with Mrs. Harrington Doyle, which required her to face away from the tea table. Mrs. Grant was looking towards the window, beyond which the back garden showed an apple tree already touched with the first russet patches of autumn. Miss Pritchard was looking at the sugar tongs. Then she looked at Miss Marple. It was a brief look, the kind that, if challenged, would be described as nothing more than the natural movement of the eye across a room. But it carried within it, Miss Marple was quite sure, a quality of significance. Not accusation, nothing so crude. Rather the expression of someone who has noticed a thing she considers noteworthy, and is privately noting that it has been noticed. The conversation continued. A few minutes later, Mrs. Harrington Doyle reached for the sugar tongs in their new position and used them without remark, as people do with objects found where they are found. But her hand paused for the faintest instant before taking them. A second, no more. The pause of someone who had expected to find them elsewhere, had absorbed the fact that they were not there, and had decided to continue without comment. Miss Marple drank her tea. The outward part of her mind attended to the conversation. The deeper part, the part which had always remained available for more serious work, considered the mechanics of what she had just seen. The tongs had been moved. She could not say with certainty by whom, because she had not been watching the table, continuously. She had been watching faces where she judged the more significant information was likely to appear. The movement about the tea table had provided sufficient cover for a very small adjustment. What she could say was this: the movement had taken place. It had created a situation in which she might plausibly appear to have used the tongs and replaced them carelessly. And Miss Pritchard had observed the outcome with precisely the kind of prepared interest that suggested she had been ready to observe it. The whole incident had occupied no more than 30 seconds. 30 seconds. A movement of perhaps 4 inches. And yet the impression created in a mind already prepared to receive it would settle, like one more tiny weight on a scale being patiently loaded. Miss Marple thought of something her mother had once said to her, very long ago, when she had been a girl of 12 and had been bewildered by a complicated disagreement among village children. She had not understood the matter at the time. Only later, much later, had she realized that one child had not needed to tell lies about another. It had been enough to begin with one well-placed suggestion and allow the others to interpret everything through it. Her mother had said that the cleverest arrangements were those which required little action after the first. Put the first thing in the proper place, and everything else followed by the ordinary operation of human nature. At 12, Miss Marple had not entirely understood. She understood now. Mrs. Grant had said something once, perhaps to Mrs. Clement, perhaps to another person. She had expressed a delicate concern about confidences not properly kept, That one remark, placed in the right ear, had seeded an expectation. And now ordinary incidents, a purse that slipped, sugar tongs out of place, were being read through that expectation and finding their meaning inside it, as naturally as water finds its level. One need not arrange very much. One need only arrange the first thing, then wait for the world to do the rest. Miss Marple accepted a second piece of lemon sponge when Mrs. Fenton pressed it upon her, which she did with considerable warmth. She complimented the cake with complete sincerity, because it was genuinely very good. Across the room, Mrs. Grant was speaking of the apple tree in the garden. "I have one myself," she said, "an old variety. I have never been able to learn its name. The fruit is small and rather hard, but excellent for jelly." "That is no bad thing," Mrs. Fenton said comfortably. "Apple jelly keeps beautifully. Bought jams are never quite the same." Mrs. Clement agreed about bought jams with conviction. The afternoon was pleasant. The fire was warm. The company appeared in all outward respects to be that of 5 women who liked one another well enough and were content in one another's presence. Miss Marple smiled at the right moments. She listened, and she thought about first things placed carefully and the long, quiet fall of everything that follows. She was beginning, she believed, to see the outline of the whole. Not all of it. Not yet. There remained the essential question of what Mrs. Grant had wished so carefully to protect. That was the missing piece. Without it, the rest was only architecture without purpose. But the architecture itself was becoming clear. And architecture, properly understood, always pointed somewhere. Miss Marple would be patient. Patience, in her experience, was almost always rewarded. She finished her second piece of lemon sponge and said, with perfect truth, that she could not remember when she had eaten better cake. Chapter 5. A line changed in the household ledger. There are certain social obligations in village life which present themselves less as invitations than as quiet expectations. They are the small duties which, if neglected, create a disturbance too slight to be called a breach, yet too perceptible to be ignored. One attends to them much as one oils a garden gate, or replaces a loose latch, not always from enthusiasm, but from the understanding that small maintenances prevent larger difficulties. A call upon a neighbour recently recovered from a slight indisposition belongs to this category. So does the offering of a pot of jam when one has made more than one requires. So too does the visit paid to someone comparatively new in the village, once they have been settled long enough to receive callers, but not so long that the attention has lost its timeliness. Miss Marple was well practised in all such obligations. She discharged them without visible reluctance, and not entirely as a matter of performance. She had long ago concluded that the social fabric of village life, though frequently tiresome in its demands, was worth maintaining. Indeed, most of its obligations contained, upon closer examination, more genuine pleasure than they had first seemed to promise. It was in the spirit of one such obligation, or at least of something that could very reasonably be presented as one, that Miss Marple found herself on a Thursday morning of that same week calling at Hawthorn Lodge, the house occupied by Mrs. Lydia Grant. Hawthorn Lodge stood on the better side of the village, which meant that the houses there had somewhat larger gardens, somewhat fewer drains requiring attention, and a lane which widened just enough to suggest quiet consequence without openly declaring superiority. The house itself was solidly Edwardian, double-fronted and well-maintained, with a garden that reflected its owner's character. It was orderly without being severe, presentable without being showy. The borders were neatly edged, and the lawn was cut to a length that suggested regular attention rather than anxious perfectionism. The occasion for Miss Marple's visit was a cutting from her apricot climber, which Mrs. Grant had admired some weeks earlier in conversation. Miss Marple carried it in a small pot, wrapped in damp cloth against the morning air, and presented it at the door with the warm simplicity of someone doing a small and natural thing. Mrs. Grant received it with every appearance of genuine pleasure. She was not, Miss Marple thought, as she was welcomed into the front hallway, a woman who received visitors with visible unease. If anything, Mrs. Grant seemed more settled in her own house than elsewhere. She moved through it with the quiet confidence of someone entirely at ease with the space she occupied. Her manner towards Miss Marple was pleasant, composed, and very nearly perfect. There was no detectable embarrassment, no excessive warmth that might suggest guilt, and no coolness that might suggest fear of discovery. If Mrs. Grant was conducting a quiet campaign against Miss Marple's reputation, she was doing so with remarkable steadiness of nerve. Tea was offered and accepted. They sat in the drawing room, which was furnished with taste and a degree of individuality. There were books on the shelves which had clearly been read rather than displayed. Above the mantelpiece hung a watercolour of real delicacy, not the sort of thing one bought merely because a wall required filling. In the corner stood a writing desk, and upon it lay a tidy arrangement of correspondence and a small leather-bound book. Miss Marple observed the book without appearing to observe it. Conversation began comfortably. Mrs. Grant asked after the garden at Bramblewood Cottage with what seemed genuine interest, and for several minutes they discussed the relative merits of autumn planting versus spring planting, a subject on which Miss Marple had formed opinions over many years of practical experiment. Mrs. Grant, it emerged, had only recently taken a serious interest in gardening. Her previous house had possessed a very small garden, and she had never before felt that full engagement with soil and season which she was beginning to discover at Hawthorn Lodge. Miss Marple offered several thoughts with the generosity of one sharing something that had long given her pleasure. Mrs. Grant listened attentively, not with mere politeness, but with the manner of someone who intended to act upon what she heard. It was, in all outward respects, a perfectly agreeable conversation. In any other circumstances it would have been entirely unremarkable. Miss Marple drank her tea and, beneath the surface of the conversation, continued to attend to everything else. At one point Mrs. Grant rose to retrieve a gardening book from the shelf behind her. It was a small practical volume with a worn cloth cover, from which she wished to verify something about the planting depth of certain spring bulbs. While Mrs. Grant stood at the shelf with her back to the room for perhaps 30 seconds, Miss Marple's gaze moved, not quickly and not with any appearance of searching, across the writing desk in the corner. The leather-bound book lay open. She had noticed it when she entered the room. At that time, she had registered it as a household book of some sort, the kind in which a careful person records domestic expenditure, appointments, lists of tradesmen, and the innumerable small memoranda involved in the running of a house. It had been closed then. She was almost certain of it. The book that lay open now showed a page of neat, small handwriting. Miss Marple did not read it. She was not near enough, and she would not have done so in any case. But she noted two things. First, the entries appeared personal rather than purely domestic. The writing was more hesitant than the tidy annotations one makes beside household accounts, and it was arranged across the page in longer passages rather than brief notes. Second, the book had been opened very recently. There was a slight displacement of the page marker, a freshness in the fall of the pages, the faint lift of one corner where it had not yet settled flat. These were not things one could properly describe as evidence. They were simply things one observed, provided one had spent a lifetime observing. Mrs. Grant returned with the gardening volume, and the discussion of bulb planting continued for several pleasant minutes. Miss Marple said nothing about the household book. It was not her property. She had not read it. She had no reason to speak of it. She merely placed the observation carefully beside the others. Mrs. Grant's hands lying very still during the conversation among the roses, the expression that had not quite been surprise when the purse was recovered from the pew behind. The afternoon at Mrs. Fenton's arranging itself around a displacement of 4 inches. When Miss Marple rose to leave some 40 minutes later, she did so with the warmth of someone who had spent an agreeable morning. She thanked Mrs. Grant for the tea with complete sincerity. In the hallway, as she collected her coat and gloves, she paused for a moment beside a small table, on which lay the usual accumulation of things found near a front door. A pair of gloves that were not her own, a folded umbrella, An envelope addressed in a hand she did not recognise, and a photograph in a silver frame. It was the photograph that drew her attention. The woman in it was perhaps 35. Her face was not particularly distinctive, but her expression had something arresting in it. She had been caught in a moment of genuine feeling, the kind of photograph in which the subject has briefly forgotten that she is being photographed. She stood in a garden, and behind her, just visible at the edge of the image, was the corner of a building that looked institutional in character, broad and plain, with tall windows set at regular intervals. Miss Marple looked at it for exactly as long as one may look at a photograph in someone's hallway, without turning interest into inquiry. "Your daughter?" she asked pleasantly, as Mrs. Grant came to open the front door. There was a pause. It was not a long pause, a single breath perhaps, but it had a quality to it, the quality of a word caught before it was spoken and replaced by another. "A friend," Mrs. Grant said. "An old friend. We lost touch some years ago." She said it easily. Mrs. Grant was very good at ease. But she had moved, almost imperceptibly, between Miss Marple and the photograph. Not dramatically, not crudely. Merely with that small repositioning of the body which sometimes occurs before the conscious mind has had time to instruct it. Miss Marple said what one says about old friends with whom one has lost touch, that it was always a pity, and that one hoped things were well with her. And then she went out into the lane. She walked home by the longer route, which took her past the church and along the far edge of the village. She wanted time to think, and the longer route provided it. She was thinking about the photograph, about the woman's unguarded expression, about the building behind her, broad and plain with its tall regular windows. She was thinking, too, about what kind of old friend one keeps in a silver frame in one's hallway, yet does not wish to discuss. And she was thinking about the household book open on the writing desk. It had been opened deliberately. She was nearly sure of that now. It belonged to the same logic as the purse within reach, and the sugar tongs displaced by 4 inches. The book had been opened to a page of personal writing, and left where any visitor seated in the drawing-room might, if she were the kind of person she was being presented as being, take an interest in its contents. It was a trap of a kind, or a test, possibly both. Miss Marple had not taken the interest. She had looked at the fire, the watercolour, the gardening book. She had spoken about bulbs and soil and the reliable grace of climbing roses. She wondered whether that too had been noted. She passed the lich gate of St. Catherine's, the leaning gate and the cotoneaster with its red berries, and turned along the lane that would bring her home. The morning had clouded while she was indoors, and the air had taken on that grey softness peculiar to an autumn day, which has decided against brightness without quite committing itself to rain. Miss Marple found it, on the whole, a comfortable sort of morning for thinking. The question that occupied her most seriously was no longer the method of what was being done, that she understood well enough. It was the matter behind the method that interested her now. The woman in the silver frame, the institutional building, the hesitant handwriting in the household book, arranged in longer passages. There was something here that Mrs. Grant wished very much to keep to herself, and she was sufficiently afraid of losing that privacy that she had taken steps, careful, considered, not entirely kind steps, to ensure that if the knowledge ever surfaced, the person most likely to have supplied it would not be believed. The thing itself remained unknown, but its shape was becoming clearer. Miss Marple opened her gate, went inside, put the kettle on, and sat down at her kitchen table with a piece of paper and a pencil. She had found that writing things down, even vaguely, helped to arrange them, and the arrangement of things, in her experience, nearly always revealed something that the unarranged version had kept hidden. Chapter 6. An invitation that quietly disappeared. The second week of September brought with it a change in the quality of the light which Miss Marple always found affecting, in a way she could not quite account for by purely meteorological means. The days were still of decent length, and the temperature remained above anything that could reasonably be called cold. Yet there was something in the angle of the sun and in the particular blue of the afternoon sky, deeper than summer, more considered, that gave the impression of a world becoming serious about itself. The trees along the far edge of the churchyard were showing colour at their crowns. The swallows had gone, or nearly gone. In the air lingered the faint, clean scent of fallen leaves beginning their long and useful transformation. Miss Marple noticed these things in the automatic, undramatic way in which she noticed most things. Not exactly as occasions for feeling, though she was certainly not a woman without feeling, but as data. Information about where one stood in the orderly progression of the year. Such information had its own comfort. The year, unlike most people, could generally be trusted to proceed correctly. It was on the Tuesday of that week that she received a note from Mrs. Harrington Doyle. Mrs. Harrington Doyle was not, it must be understood, the sort of woman who wrote notes lightly. Over the years, Miss Marple had known her. She had sent perhaps a dozen. Each had been purposeful and precisely worded. Invitations with times specified almost to the quarter hour. Acceptances that managed to convey pleasure and punctuality in the same sentence. And, on one occasion, a letter of condolence which Miss Marple privately considered one of the finest examples of that difficult genre she had ever received. Mrs. Harrington Doyle's communications arrived in cream envelopes, her full name written on the flap in a firm and legible hand. One opened them with the sense that their contents would prove both clear and considered. This note was brief. It explained with every courtesy that the small dinner gathering Mrs. Harrington Doyle had been planning for the following Friday, an occasion she had mentioned to Miss Marple some weeks earlier, casually but with evident pleasure, would after all have to be rather more limited in number than first imagined. The dining room, she wrote, was to have its floor attended to. The arrangement had been made at short notice, and the inconvenience of a reduced table would unfortunately be unavoidable. She hoped Miss Marple would understand and trusted they would have the pleasure of her company before too long in other circumstances. The note was signed with warm regards. From beginning to end it was perfectly kind. Miss Marple read it twice, folded it, and set it on the kitchen table beside her morning tea. She was not a woman given to self-pity. That is a quality which serves one well in a long life, since opportunities for self-pity are numerous, and its satisfaction is brief, stale, and ultimately corrosive. She did not sit at the table with a sense of injury. She sat with a sense of attention, the particular quality of attention she directed towards things that required understanding. The floor of Mrs. Harrington Doyle's dining room had, to Miss Marple's reasonably accurate knowledge, been relayed not 3 years earlier. At the time, it had been a matter of considerable discussion in the village, since the craftsmen brought in to do the work had made various difficulties about the materials available, and the project had extended itself 2 weeks beyond the promised date. Mrs. Harrington Doyle had suffered the inconvenience with impressive dignity, and had described that inconvenience to several people with her customary clarity. 3 years was not, in Miss Marple's experience, the interval at which such work was ordinarily repeated. That did not mean the explanation was false. Flaws, like people, sometimes developed unexpected weaknesses at inconvenient moments. Mrs. Harrington Doyle might have noticed a board. A contractor might have been engaged at short notice and proved difficult to reschedule. The explanation was perfectly possible, and Miss Marple was too careful a thinker to dismiss a thing merely because it was inconveniently timed. But she noted it, and she placed it beside the other things she had noted. Then she felt the whole accumulation settle into a new arrangement. She went about the morning's work. Some correspondence was attended to. The kitchen garden was visited briefly for an inspection of what remained to be done before the first frost. She spent a period by the sitting-room window with her knitting, though the work advanced less steadily than usual. Her mind being occupied with other matters, she was thinking about Mrs. Harrington Doyle. What did it mean when a woman of that character and habit, a woman who had extended an invitation warmly, who had spoken of the evening with anticipation, quietly withdrew it with an explanation that was courteous, complete, and not entirely satisfying? She was thinking about the speed at which an idea could move through a small community when it was carried, not by one person, but by the general current of social life. She had seen it happen before, in different circumstances and with different materials. An impression, once established, acquired a kind of authority wholly unrelated to evidence. People did not, on the whole, examine their impressions with the same rigour they applied to jam recipes, household accounts, or the correct pruning of roses. They felt them, they acted upon the feeling, and then they called it judgment. It had been just over 2 weeks since Mrs. Grant had made her carefully phrased observation among the rose beds. In that fortnight the idea had moved from Mrs. Grant to Mrs. Clement, then presumably from Mrs. Clement to others. It had been assisted by the purse at church, by the sugar tongs at Mrs. Fenton's, by smaller transactions Miss Marple had not witnessed but could very well imagine, and now it had reached Mrs. Harrington Doyle. Mrs. Harrington Doyle was not a woman of uncertain character. She would not have acted from mere spite. She had concluded, presumably on the basis of what she had heard and found credible, that the Friday gathering ought to proceed without Miss Marple. It was effective. Miss Marple could acknowledge that without rancour. It was remarkably effective, and it had been accomplished with the minimum of anything that could be called action. No accusation, no confrontation, no scene of any kind. Merely the patient, invisible work of an idea placed in the right soil and left to grow. She set down her knitting and looked out at the lane. It was empty in the mid-morning way of village lanes, quiet and quite ordinary beneath the September sky. She thought again about the photograph. She had been thinking about it at intervals since her visit to Hawthorn Lodge. The woman in the silver frame, perhaps 35, the expression of unguarded feeling. The building behind her, institutional in character with its tall regular windows. Mrs. Grant had called her an old friend, and had moved almost imperceptibly between Miss Marple and the image. An old friend with whom touch had been lost. People kept photographs of those who mattered to them. They placed them on shelves, mantelpieces, tables in hallways. But the hallway table had a particular significance. It was where one set things that belonged to daily life. Things seen each time one entered or left the house. A photograph placed there was not merely an ornament. It was a presence. A daily reminder of someone or something one wished to remember. An old friend with whom one had lost touch was not usually that kind of presence. Such photographs belonged in albums, perhaps, or in the drawers of writing desks, not in a silver frame by the front door. There was also Mrs. Grant's hesitation, that single breath of a pause before she had chosen the word friend. Miss Marple had noticed it then. She noticed it again now in memory. It was the hesitation of someone selecting, not the first word that came naturally, but the word that would serve best. The institutional building, the hesitation, the silver frame, the household book with its longer, more personal entries opened on the desk. Miss Marple did not yet have the connection between these things. She had the things themselves, and she had the beginning of a shape around them, not sharp enough to trace, but definite enough to feel. There was someone in Mrs. Grant's life whose existence she was careful not to advertise. The care she took was considerable, and the fear behind it, for Miss Marple had been saying to herself from the beginning that fear, not cruelty, lay at the root of this, must be proportionate. What one fears losing, one protects. What one protects, one may take steps to ensure cannot be taken away. Those steps need not be cruel in intention to produce unkind effects. There was a knock at the front door. Miss Marple set aside her knitting and went to answer it. Dolly Bantry stood on the step with a basket of late tomatoes from the kitchen garden, and the expression of a woman who had something on her mind and intended to share it in the spirit of friendship. "I was passing," Dolly said. This was not entirely accurate, since Bramblewood Cottage was not precisely on the route between Dolly's house and anywhere she was likely to have been going that morning. But Miss Marple accepted the statement without comment, as one does with friends who use the language of casualness to perform the work of purpose. They settled in the sitting-room. Dolly declined tea on the grounds that she had recently had some, and instead sat forward in her chair with the directness of a woman who had decided to speak. "I heard something," she said, "from Celia Fenton. She did not intend it as a confidence. Or perhaps she did, in that way people have of saying things while pretending they are merely thinking aloud. But I thought you should know." "Tell me," said Miss Marple. "Apparently there is a feeling." Celia put it just like that. A feeling, which generally means someone is not certain enough to make a statement, but would like the effect of having made one. Miss Marple's eyes rested quietly on Dolly's face. "A feeling," Dolly continued, "that you may have made yourself rather too familiar with things at Mrs. Grant's house that were not entirely your concern." She paused. She could not be specific, which I thought rather telling. "Indeed," said Miss Marple. "It is nonsense, obviously," Dolly said with her customary decisiveness. "I do not know what is behind it, and I should very much like to." "So should I," Miss Marple said, with complete honesty. "I am beginning to have an idea, but I am not yet certain enough to say anything I would wish to be held to." "Is there anything I can do?" Dolly asked. Miss Marple looked at her friend, at the warmth and directness of her, at the loyalty that was as uncomplicated as it was reliable, and felt a gratitude too settled for easy expression. "Not yet," she said, "but I'm very glad to know that you're there." Dolly nodded in the manner of someone who understood an assignment and intended to fulfill it. Then she reached for one of the tomatoes from the basket, examined it critically, and began to talk about the kitchen garden instead, with the easy transition of a person who has said the important thing and is content to let it rest. Outside, the September afternoon continued in its composed and serious way. The light fell at its new angle across the lane, and the first few leaves drifted with unhurried purpose to the ground. Chapter 7. A portion offered without kindness. The reading circle met on the third Thursday of each month in the parlour of whichever member happened to be hosting it that season. The rotation had been established some years before, with the intention of distributing both the honour and the inconvenience as fairly as possible. There were 8 regular participants, with occasional additions whenever someone new arrived in the village and expressed an interest in literature, company, or cake. The books themselves were selected by a process which involved a great deal of discussion and remarkably little agreement, though this too had become part of the entertainment. Miss Marple had belonged to the circle since its beginning. She was, by some distance, its longest-serving participant, and her contributions to the monthly discussions were generally well regarded. They were neither too brief to be useful nor too extended to be comfortable. They were informed, too, by that practical understanding of human motives which Miss Marple had acquired over many years of village observation, and which tended to illuminate fictional characters quite as effectively as literary theory, occasionally more so. This month's hostess was Mrs. Arabella Monk, who lived in a Victorian terrace house near the far end of the High Street, and kept an extraordinary number of houseplants in her front room. Sitting among them gave one the agreeable sensation of reading inside a small and well-heated conservatory. Mrs. Monk was a cheerful, slightly scattered woman in her middle 50s, with a genuine enthusiasm for books and a less reliable memory for which books she had already read. This occasionally added an element of surprise to her responses during discussion, especially when she found herself disagreeing with views she had apparently expressed the previous year. Miss Marple arrived at 7 o'clock, which was the appointed time, and found that she was neither first nor last. Mrs. Clement was already settled near the window with her copy of the evening's book, a 19th-century novel concerning the inheritance disputes of a family in the north of England. It had been selected largely because 2 members of the circle had read it before, and could therefore be relied upon to begin the discussion, while the others were still finding their feet among the relations, wills, disappointments, and contested estates. Miss Pritchard occupied the chair nearest the door, as was her preference. 2 other members, Miss Rosalind Hook, a retired schoolmistress, and Mrs. Patience Greaves, who kept the village's small lending library, were discussing something near the mantelpiece with the focused animation of people who have discovered they agree and are pleased by the novelty of it. Mrs. Lydia Grant arrived 5 minutes after Miss Marple, and the room completed itself shortly afterwards with the addition of Mrs. Monk's neighbour, Mrs. Dallow, who came largely, as far as anyone could determine, for the cake, which Mrs. Monk reliably produced in quantity and of excellent quality. The discussion began amiably and soon became genuinely interesting. The novel lent itself to opinions about inheritance law, family obligation, duty, property, resentment, and whether the eldest son in the story was more to be pitied than condemned. On this last point the circle divided itself with some spirit. Mrs. Clement inclined towards pity, Miss Hook towards condemnation, and Mrs. Dallow, who had not quite followed the plot, thought the whole family would have been happier if someone had sold the house in Chapter 3. Miss Marple made several observations which caused people to pause and reconsider. This was the contribution she most naturally made, and, if she were honest, the one she found most satisfying. She rarely contradicted directly. She merely set down some small human truth beside the matter under discussion, and allowed others to discover for themselves that the matter looked different in its company. Throughout the discussion, however, she remained aware of something else. She had been aware of it since entering the room, though she had not addressed it directly in her own thoughts. She preferred to let such impressions settle before examining them. A first impression was useful, but a repeated impression was better. The change was not large. It was not rude. Indeed, that was precisely what made it difficult. It consisted in the absence of certain things, small surpluses of warmth that had previously characterized her relations with several people in the room. Mrs. Clement, in greeting her, had been pleasant in the way one is pleasant with a person one wishes no ill, but about whom one feels presently uncertain. Miss Pritchard's acknowledgment had been correct but brief, lacking its usual flavour of shared understanding. Even Mrs. Monk, whose hospitality was generally robust enough to encompass almost anyone and anything, had welcomed her with a slight deliberateness, as though she had reminded herself to be welcoming, and had thereby become conscious of the act. Natural warmth is never self-conscious. This had been. It was, Miss Marple reflected, rather like entering a room one had known for years, and finding that the furniture had been shifted by an inch. Nothing was obviously altered, yet nothing stood quite where one expected it to stand. The evening's refreshments were served at the halfway point, as was customary. Mrs. Monk brought in a tray bearing slices of Victoria sponge of impressive height, while tea and coffee were poured according to preference. Miss Marple accepted a cup of tea and a slice of cake, which looked very good. She noticed, without appearing to notice, that her slice was served last. It was also somewhat thinner than those offered before it, and Mrs. Monk, placing it beside her, did not make the small additional gesture she had made with several of the others. The little nudge of the plate, the extra word about hoping one had a good appetite, the instinctive smile of a hostess giving pleasure. It was nothing. Cake was not cut with mathematical precision. Hosts grew distracted. Manners varied from guest to guest without any intention behind the variation. Under ordinary circumstances, Miss Marple would not have given it a second thought. But the cumulative texture of the evening had a character she was now sufficiently acquainted with to read. It was the texture of people who had been given a feeling about someone, and were honouring that feeling, not through cruelty, but through the unconscious social mathematics of groups. A slight recalibration had occurred. No one had decided to be cold. No one, perhaps, had decided anything at all. Each person had merely adjusted by the smallest degree to the altered general temperature. Together, those private adjustments produced an effect that none of them, if challenged, would have been able to identify or admit. Miss Marple ate the cake, which was very good, and drank her tea. She spoke with Miss Hook about the novel's treatment of women's property rights, with every appearance of absorption in the topic, and she very nearly managed to be absorbed because the topic was genuinely interesting. At the same time, she was thinking about gesture. What distinguished genuine warmth from its formal equivalent was precisely the surplus. The little things people offered when they felt freely rather than correctly. The extra word, the slight lean forward, the instinctive smile, the hand that offered the better slice without calculating why. These were not things one could ask for. Their absence, therefore, could not be accused. One could not say to Mrs. Monk, "You did not nudge my plate as you nudged the others." One could not say to Mrs. Clement, "Your greeting was of the correct duration, but lacked its usual quality of genuine gladness." Such remarks would be absurd if spoken aloud. They would also be devastating if understood. This, Miss Marple thought, was the final refinement of her present difficulty. The accumulation was composed entirely of things that could not be named. Each element was deniable, more than deniable, invisible to anyone not paying a certain kind of attention. The effect, however, was quite real, and entirely legible to the person at whom it was directed. She could feel it as clearly as one feels a drop in temperature. She simply had no means of pointing to it. She remembered a woman she had once known in quite different circumstances, a relation of a relation encountered at a family occasion, who had described just such a situation many years earlier in another village. The woman had said that the worst of it was not the exclusion itself, but the impossibility of response. You could not defend yourself because the charges were never stated. You could not ask for explanation because none had been offered. You could only remain present, correct, and apparently unaware. Miss Marple had remembered the account at the time with the interested compassion of someone who has not yet experienced the matter described. She found now that it had been accurate in every particular. The strain of maintained unawareness was indeed considerable. She believed she had managed it reasonably well. The discussion resumed after refreshments. The second half centred on the ending of the novel, which several members found unsatisfying, and which Miss Hook defended with the conviction of someone whose aesthetic principles had been challenged at the root. Mrs. Grant made a measured and perceptive observation about the novelist choosing to prioritise moral resolution over practical resolution. Miss Marple thought it exactly right, and said so. Mrs. Grant received the agreement with a brief smile which appeared entirely genuine. That was one of the things that made Mrs. Grant difficult to regard simply. She was a woman of intelligence, genuine cultivation, and in the ordinary course of social life, agreeable company. The thing she was doing, the thing Miss Marple now felt considerable certainty she was doing, did not erase these qualities. It sat beside them, uncomfortably, but truthfully. Miss Marple had found that people were very rarely made of one thing. The good did not cancel the bad, nor did the bad cancel the good. One was obliged, if one wished to understand anything at all, to hold two true assessments in the mind at the same time. Mrs. Grant was a woman acting from fear. She was protecting something she valued. She was using the tools available to her in the social environment she inhabited. Those tools were subtle, they were considerable, and she used them with skill. The damage they caused was real, but it was the collateral damage of self-preservation rather than the direct product of malice. This did not make it acceptable, but it made it comprehensible, and comprehension, for Miss Marple, was always the necessary beginning of any useful response. The circle dispersed at 9 o'clock with the usual warmth of endings. Coats retrieved, thanks expressed, brief conversations at the door about the following month's selection, which was still unsettled. Mrs. Dallow hoped for something shorter. Miss Hook hoped for something better. Mrs. Monk said vaguely that she was sure they would find something delightful. Miss Pritchard walked part of the way with Miss Marple, as she sometimes did, and talked about the eldest son in the novel with the lingering engagement of someone not yet done with the subject. At the point where their routes divided, they said good night. Miss Marple walked the remaining distance to Bramblewood Cottage alone, through the cool and quiet dark of the September evening. She was thinking, as she walked, about a decision she'd made during the reading circle discussion without being quite aware of making it. She had enough now, enough to understand the shape of the thing, if not all its contents, enough to see where the source was, what it was protecting, and something of why. What she did not yet have was the particular detail that would make understanding actionable, the knowledge of what Mrs. Grant feared so concretely and completely that she had taken these careful, quiet steps to insulate herself against it. Without that detail, Understanding remained private, and private understanding was often useless. With it, something might be possible. She needed, Miss Marple thought, to know more about the woman in the silver frame, and she believed she knew how to begin. Chapter 8. A desk left in suspicious order. Miss Marple had, over the course of a long life, made it her business to know a great many people, not in the superficial sense of having been introduced, exchanged pleasantries, and then forgotten them, but in the more useful sense of understanding something of their histories, connections, habits, and the particular texture of their characters. This knowledge had accumulated without any deliberate scheme. It was simply the result of a curious and retentive mind applied, consistently and without vanity, to the material presented by daily life. It had proved, on more occasions than Miss Marple could conveniently count, to be of considerable practical value. In the present situation, it suggested a particular avenue of inquiry. She knew, or had once known, and had no reason to suppose the knowledge had become inaccurate, that Mrs. Fenton's cousin had for some years been employed as an administrator at a private residential establishment in the neighbouring county. The establishment in question was of the kind that occupied large houses in their own grounds, and provided, with considerable discretion, for those whose circumstances required a degree of supported living. Miss Marple had first learned of this connection some 3 years before in the entirely accidental fashion by which one learned things from Mrs. Fenton. That is to say, through the medium of a conversation about something else entirely, during which the information had presented itself as a natural digression, and lodged itself in Miss Marple's memory without any encouragement. At the time, she had supposed the knowledge useful only to a general understanding of Mrs. Fenton's family arrangements. She was now revising that assessment. She called on Mrs. Fenton on a Friday morning under the perfectly genuine pretext of returning a recipe for preserved quinces which she had borrowed some months earlier, and had, she said, only just copied out properly. Mrs. Fenton received her with the open-armed pleasure she extended to all visitors, settled her in the sitting-room with the promptness of long habit, and disappeared into the kitchen to put the kettle on. Miss Marple was left in the comfortable warmth of the room, with its accumulated objects and its particular smell of wood polish and potpourri, which she had always associated with being welcome somewhere. The conversation passed, after the usual openings, through several topics of mutual interest before Miss Marple introduced the subject she had come to introduce. "I have been thinking," she said, in the reflective tone of someone pursuing a train of thought which has nothing directly to do with the person in front of her, "about a situation I encountered once, entirely in the abstract, you understand, concerning private establishments of the residential kind. One does not always know quite what is available, or how one might make suitable inquiries if the need arose." Mrs. Fenton required very little encouragement to speak on any subject, and her essential nature was benevolent. She said at once that she knew something of that world through her cousin Marjorie, who had worked in it for years and was a great authority on the matter. The conversation that followed was entirely natural. Miss Marple had never felt less that she was extracting information, and more that she was simply receiving it. This, she had found, was the best possible condition under which information presented itself. Mrs. Fenton spoke warmly of her cousin, who was by all accounts a capable and dedicated woman with a gift for administration and the practical compassion such work required. She described the establishment. Large grounds, she said, a converted manor house, very well regarded, the kind of place families of a certain kind sought out when they wished for good care combined with absolute privacy. Very discreet, Mrs. Fenton added. Cousin Marjorie always says discretion is as important as the care itself to the families concerned. Quite so, said Miss Marple. I imagine privacy is enormously valued. Oh, enormously, said Mrs. Fenton. Marjorie says you would be surprised, though perhaps you would not. How many families have someone in such a place and never speak of it? Not from shame exactly, or not always. More from the feeling that it is private, a family matter. And the establishment itself, Miss Marple asked mildly, is some distance from here, you said. The other side of Milchester, 12 miles, I should think. One of those old houses on the Alderton Road. Miss Marple received this with the appearance of mild general interest and steered the conversation towards other things. She remained for another 20 minutes, drank her tea to its comfortable conclusion, and took her leave with warmth. She walked home with the steady deliberation that characterised all her movements. And she thought about the Alderton Road, about a house with tall windows set at regular intervals, about a woman of perhaps 35 photographed in a garden with an expression of unguarded feeling. She thought she understood now the broad shape of what Mrs. Grant was protecting. It was not necessarily something discreditable. Families who placed relatives in such establishments did not always do so from any motive requiring concealment. Often the reasons were practical, compassionate, painful, or simply private. But concealment was practiced nonetheless, and for reasons which had much to do with social pride and the fear of misunderstanding. St. Mary Mead was a village. Villages had long memories and a comprehensive interest in their members' private arrangements. A woman of Mrs. Grant's standing, her composure, her influence, her carefully built position in village life, might reasonably dread such knowledge becoming common currency. Not because it was wrong, but because it would be discussed, and discussion of a certain kind was its own form of exposure. The question was not whether the secret was shameful. The question was whether the fear of its discovery was strong enough to have produced the conduct Miss Marple had observed over the previous 3 weeks. She believed it was. In Miss Marple's experience, the magnitude of a person's protective action was not always proportionate to the magnitude of the thing protected. It was proportionate instead to the magnitude of the fear. That was a rather different calculation, and it often produced responses which, when measured against the secret itself, seemed disproportionate to an outside observer. The fear of losing one's position, one's dignity, one's regard, the careful life one had built. These were fears capable of driving a composed and intelligent person towards steps she might not, in a calmer moment, have considered. Miss Marple had reached this point in her thinking when she arrived at Hawthorn Lodge for what she had arranged by a brief note the previous day as a second call. It was, she had written, quite natural in the circumstances, since she wished to know how the apricot climber was settling in, and she had another cutting she thought might be welcome. This time, a late-flowering clematis which did well against a north-facing wall. Mrs. Grant received her, as she had on the previous occasion, with composed and pleasant warmth. There was no visible unease. The sitting-room was as it had been before, the watercolour above the mantelpiece, the well-read books on the shelves, the writing desk in the corner. The writing desk, however, was not quite as it had been. On the previous visit it had been tidy in the way of a person organised by habit. Papers in approximate order, the household book in its proper place, a pen and ink well positioned for use. It had been the desk of someone who worked there regularly and maintained it without self-consciousness. Today, it possessed a different quality. The papers were squared with a precision that spoke of intention rather than habit. The household book was closed and placed exactly at the left-hand corner. The pen lay parallel to the desk's front edge with an exactness not arrived at by accident. And in the centre of the desk lay a folded letter. It was not sealed, merely folded, positioned as though recently set aside after reading, or as though placed to be noticed. Miss Marple observed all this in the time it took her to cross the room and settle into the chair she had occupied on the previous visit. Perhaps 4 seconds. She did not look at the desk again. They spoke for some time about the garden and the clematis, about the progress of the apricot climber, which Mrs. Grant said was showing a new shoot at its base, always a promising sign. They spoke of the reading circle's recent meeting and its book, which Mrs. Grant discussed with the same perceptive intelligence she had shown on the evening itself. They spoke of the harvest festival and whether the weather would hold. Throughout, Miss Marple preserved the same quality of pleasant, untroubled attention that she had maintained across all their recent encounters. She did not refer to anything that had passed between them, not directly, not indirectly. She gave Mrs. Grant no indication by word, look, or pause that she had observed anything, concluded anything or intended anything. She was thinking, however, with considerable concentration, about the writing desk. During the previous visit, she had noticed that the household book contained personal writing, longer passages arranged across the page in the manner of someone recording something private and emotional. She had not read it, and did not intend to. But she had understood then, and understood more fully now, what the deliberate positioning of these things was meant to suggest. On the earlier visit, the household book had been left open, as though Miss Marple might have looked at it. On this visit, the desk had been arranged too neatly, with the letter placed centre forward, as though she might be expected to take an interest in it. And then Mrs. Grant had left her alone in the sitting room while she went to the kitchen to make tea, as she did at the start of any visit. 4 minutes, perhaps 5. Miss Marple sat in her chair and looked at the watercolour above the mantelpiece. It was a coastal scene, cliffs and grey water, restrained and rather good. She did not move. When Mrs. Grant returned with the tea tray, the desk was exactly as she had left it. Whatever the letter contained, and Miss Marple thought she could form a reasonable guess, it had not been read, and therefore could not now be claimed to have been read. The trap, such as it was, had not been sprung. Miss Marple accepted her tea with a pleasant remark about the warmth of the room, and as she did so she observed a very small thing. Mrs. Grant's gaze moved briefly and involuntarily towards the writing desk, then away. In that brief, involuntary glance, Miss Marple saw something she had not expected to see, given the composure that had marked their every interaction since August. It was not satisfaction, it was not calculation. It was unmistakably the look of someone who had hoped for a particular outcome and had been denied it. Someone who, beneath the composed and pleasant surface, was not entirely certain what to do next. Miss Marple thought, with a compassion that was entirely genuine and somewhat inconvenient, "She is beginning to find this as exhausting as I am." The realization changed something in her understanding of how the matter ought now to proceed. Quietly, but significantly. Chapter 9. How suspicion crept in so naturally. Dolly Bantry arrived at Bramblewood Cottage on a Saturday morning when the weather had settled into that grey still softness which early October sometimes offers as compensation for the colour it has begun to take from the hedges. She came without pretext. No basket of tomatoes, no borrowed book, no item requiring return. This absence of explanation was itself a kind of communication, since Dolly's pretextless arrivals invariably meant that something had lodged itself firmly in her mind, and that she intended to attend to it without ceremony. Miss Marple had expected her. Not on that particular morning precisely, but at some point within that general period. The conversation they had begun a fortnight before had possessed a quality of incompleteness which Dolly was constitutionally disinclined to leave unresolved. She was not a woman comfortable with things left pending, especially when those things concerned a friend. They settled in the sitting-room, where Miss Marple had already made up a fire against the grey morning. The pale blue knitting sat in its customary place beside the armchair, and the light through the window gave the room a collected, inward-looking quality, which Miss Marple had always found well suited to serious conversation. "Well," said Dolly, with the directness of someone who had prepared an opening and saw no reason to delay it. "You said you were beginning to have an idea. I should like to hear it, if you're now certain enough." "I believe I am," said Miss Marple, "or sufficiently so." She set down her knitting and arranged her thoughts, though in truth they were already arranged. She had ordered and reordered them over the preceding days until they had reached that settled clarity which, in her experience, meant readiness. "You will recall," she began, "that some time ago, perhaps 6 or 7 weeks before the afternoon among the roses, Mrs. Grant called on me here. It was a perfectly ordinary call, the kind one makes and receives regularly. It was pleasant in the way such calls often are. But towards the end of it, she said something she had not, I think, originally intended to say." Dolly leaned forward slightly. It came at a moment when the conversation had grown rather more comfortable than she expected, Miss Marple continued, People do sometimes say things in such moments that they later wish they had not. A confidence escapes because for a few minutes one feels less alone with it. Dolly nodded. She was listening with the whole of her attention, which, when she chose to deploy it, was a considerable thing. She spoke of a family matter, Miss Marple said. Not entirely specifically. She caught herself, I think, before saying more than she meant to say. But what she did say was sufficient to suggest that there was someone in her close family whose situation required a particular kind of care. Someone who had, for some years, been living in a private residential establishment of a discreet character. Dolly's expression changed, but she did not interrupt. She framed it as a general reflection, Miss Marple went on the difficulty of such situations, and on the isolation one feels when carrying a private concern which cannot easily be spoken of. She was, I think, genuinely moved as she spoke. Then she collected herself, and we returned to other subjects, and nothing further was said. Miss Marple paused. Outside, a wood pigeon in the garden produced its comfortable, unhurried repetition. The sound seemed for a moment to make the sitting room even quieter. I did not, at the time, attach any improper weight to the confidence, Miss Marple said. Only the weight due to a private matter shared in a moment of unguarded feeling. I did not repeat it. I did not intend to repeat it. I considered it, as one does consider things one has been told, but only privately, as part of one's understanding of another person's circumstances. I gave Mrs. Grant no reason, by word or manner, to think that what she had said would travel any further than this room. But she regretted it, Dolly said. She regretted it almost immediately. I noticed, though I did not remark on it at the time, a slight withdrawal as she was leaving, a reconsideration, the look of someone who has performed a small and irreversible act and is not yet sure how much it may cost. Dolly was silent for a moment. And so, she said slowly, she decided to ensure that if it ever did travel, it would not be believed. Precisely, said Miss Marple. It is a very human response to a fear of that particular kind. She could not retrieve the confidence. It had been given. She could not be certain that I would hold it, though I would have done. What she could do was take preemptive steps to ensure that my word on any such matter would be received with hesitation. Dolly's mouth tightened. To make people doubt you. To make people doubt me just enough, said Miss Marple. Not to accuse me, not to attack me. That would have been crude and might have provoked offence, merely to suggest very gently that perhaps I was not quite as discreet as I had been thought, that perhaps confidence once given to me was not entirely safe. She said this without heat. She had lived with the understanding for long enough now that indignation had passed into something quieter. Not forgiveness exactly, not yet, but something closer to sorrow, though Miss Marple was not a woman who often used such words of herself. By suggesting you were indiscreet, Dolly said, in a tone of controlled and entirely characteristic indignation. Yes, Miss Marple agreed, very gently, never with any particular statement, simply a feeling introduced into the air through a remark here, an implication there, and then left to travel by the natural mechanisms of village life, which are, as we both know, remarkably efficient. Dolly made a sound that was not quite a word but conveyed a complete opinion. The remarkable part, Miss Marple continued, her tone becoming more thoughtful, is not that she did it, but how well it worked. That is what I have been considering most carefully. She lifted the pale blue knitting, then set it down again without taking up a stitch. She planted a single seed in 2 or 3 conversations at most. Within 3 weeks, the effects were visible across a considerable part of village life. Mrs. Clement carried it forward with sincerity and good intentions. Miss Pritchard observed things with her usual interest, and drew conclusions without requiring much encouragement. Mrs. Harrington Doyle acted upon a feeling she could not have identified or named. The reading circle adjusted its manner without any member consciously deciding to do so. Dolly's eyes had grown darker. No one was asked to do anything, Miss Marple said. No one was told anything that could properly be called an accusation. Everything was presented as concern, tentative, charitable, almost reluctant. That is why it travelled so smoothly. And people believed it, Dolly said, because they trust Lydia Grant. Because they trust her, said Miss Marple, and because it is easier to believe something than to resist believing it, particularly when the person presenting it is trusted, and the person it concerns has no way of knowing that anything is being presented. The idea spreads through the community's ordinary social current. As it travels, it acquires the authority of general sentiment. By the time it reaches anyone, it is no longer Mrs. Grant's anxiety. It is simply what people feel. Dolly sat very still. This time the fire settled in the grate, and the wood pigeon outside said its piece twice more before desisting. "What is she protecting?" Dolly asked at last. "You said you had an idea." "I believe," Miss Marple said carefully, "that there is a member of her immediate family, a daughter, I think, though I'm not entirely certain, who has for some years resided in a private establishment on the Alderton Road, the kind of place that provides supported living for those who require particular care." Dolly's expression softened, though the indignation did not leave it entirely. "There is a photograph in Mrs. Grant's hallway," Miss Marple continued, "of a young woman, perhaps 35, taken in a garden with an institutional building visible behind her. Mrs. Grant described her as an old friend. Before doing so, she paused, and then she moved between me and the photograph in a manner that was not, I think, meant to be noticed." Dolly received this with a stillness that, in a woman of her temperament, indicated real seriousness. "There is no shame in it," she said presently. "Not the slightest," said Miss Marple. "None whatsoever." "No," Miss Marple agreed. "These things occur in families. The care taken may be entirely admirable, but people fear what they fear. Her fear, as I understand it, is not of the fact itself, but of the discussion, of becoming, in the eyes of the village, something other than what she is so carefully arranged to be, of a private matter becoming public property. The irony," Dolly said slowly, "is that the steps she took to protect herself from discovery have made everything considerably worse." "Considerably," said Miss Marple, "and I think she is beginning to know it." Dolly looked at her sharply. "You think so?" "Yes. She's a woman of real intelligence and self-awareness. I believe the campaign, if one may call it that, has become disagreeable to her, not necessarily from sudden conscience, though I would not rule that out entirely, but from the practical recognition that it has acquired momentum and a character she did not fully intend. She started it." "Yes," Miss Marple said, "but not every person who starts a thing understands what it will become. That is one of the dangers of beginning with fear." Dolly sat back in her chair. "What will you do?" Miss Marple picked up her knitting, not because she intended to knit, but because she thought better with something in her hands. "I do not intend to confront her," she said. "That would serve no one well. It would produce distress, denial, and an unpleasant complication of the existing situation. Nor do I intend to defend myself publicly or privately. To do so would require me to explain what I am defending against, and that would bring the whole matter into the open in a way I do not think necessary. Then what?" "I think," said Miss Marple, in the tone of someone setting down a conclusion reached through patient and careful work, "that I shall pay her another visit." Dolly waited. "And I shall speak to her, not about any of this directly, but in a way that makes it possible, if she chooses, for the matter to be allowed to rest." "You mean you will give her the chance to stop?" "I mean that I shall make it clear, without saying so, that her confidence remains as safe as it has always been, that I have understood something of what she's afraid of, and that I have no intention of using it, that the thing she feared was never in any real danger." Miss Marple paused. "It is the only thing, I think, that will actually resolve the situation. One cannot resolve a fear by addressing only its symptoms. One must address the fear itself." Dolly Bantry sat back in her chair and looked at her friend with an expression that was not simple admiration. Dolly was not given to simple admiration. This was something more considered, more affectionate, and perhaps a little troubled. "You're a remarkable woman, Jane," she said. though I think you are rather more generous than the situation strictly requires." "Perhaps," said Miss Marple, "but I have found, as a general principle, that generosity is rarely wasted even when it is not, strictly speaking, deserved." She returned her attention to the pale blue knitting. The fire burned with its usual steadiness. Outside, the wood pigeon, having apparently considered the matter further, resumed. Chapter 10. The room returns to its old rhythms. Miss Marple called at Hawthorn Lodge on a Tuesday morning, 10 days after her conversation with Dolly Bantry, at a time she'd selected with care. Not too early. One did not arrive at another person's door before they had settled properly into the day. Not too late either, since an overly precise hour might give the visit an air of contrivance. 10:30 was the time she settled upon, and she arrived at it without apparent design, having spent the preceding hour in the kitchen garden doing the last of the autumn tidying which the first cold nights had made unavoidable. She brought nothing with her this time, no cutting, no small gift, no pretext of exchange. She had decided the visit would be more honest without one, and honesty, of a careful, considered, oblique kind, was precisely what she intended. Mrs. Grant answered the door herself, as she generally did. Her expression on seeing Miss Marple was the one that had become familiar over the past weeks. Composed, pleasant, and containing somewhere within it a quality of watchfulness which the composure had been specifically designed to conceal. She welcomed Miss Marple in with every courtesy. Miss Marple accepted the welcome with the natural ease of someone who had no consciousness of anything being other than straightforward between them. They went to the sitting room. The writing desk in the corner was in its ordinary state, the practical, unself-conscious tidiness of a desk in daily use, nothing arranged with deliberate precision, the household book in its usual place, a pen resting across it. The room itself had recovered the quality it must have possessed before any of this had begun, a room inhabited by a person of taste, order, and private life, going about its ordinary purposes without arrangement. Miss Marple noted this with quiet satisfaction. She said nothing about it. Tea was made and brought. They settled into conversation about the usual things, the harvest festival, which had been pronounced a success by general agreement, the weather, which had turned markedly cooler since the weekend, and the Ashford House residents, about whom further detail had now emerged. Upon examination they proved to be quite unexceptional people, who kept reasonable hours and had introduced themselves to their neighbours with a friendliness that predicted no great difficulties. Mrs. Grant spoke and listened with her usual intelligence. On the surface, the conversation possessed every quality of a pleasant morning call between two women on agreeable terms. It was Miss Marple who moved them from the surface, and she did so in exactly the way she had intended, gently, without any appearance of intention. During a natural pause following an observation about the harvest festival flowers, she said that she had lately been thinking about the particular difficulty of carrying private concerns in a public setting. She said it in a reflective, impersonal tone, the kind one uses for thoughts that have arrived independently of present company, as though she were merely giving voice to something that had occupied her mind in general terms. "One develops, I think, a kind of vigilance," she said, "about what is shared and what is not. It is exhausting to maintain over a long period, and it is never entirely reliable, because one cannot always predict when one's guard may slip." She felt rather than saw the change in Mrs. Grant's attention. Nothing visible altered, but the air in the room shifted. "I have always found," Miss Marple continued in the same thoughtful tone, "that the things one fears being known are very rarely as dangerous in reality as they are in prospect. Fear has a tendency to enlarge the thing it guards against. One imagines consequences which, upon examination, are often far less severe than the anticipation of them." She paused and looked out of the window at the garden, where the apple tree Mrs. Grant had once described was now fully in its autumn character, the leaves turning, a few already gone, the small hard fruit visible among the branches. "I had a friend once," Miss Marple said, who spent a very long time protecting a family matter she believed would damage her standing irreparably if it became known. She maintained the protection with great effort and with some cost to herself and others. She did not look at Mrs. Grant. When the matter did eventually become known, not through any failure of her own, simply through the course of events, she found that the response of those around her was almost entirely the opposite of what she had anticipated. People were, for the most part, kind. Some were simply uninterested. One or two were better friends to her afterwards than they had been before, because she had allowed them to know something true. She said it without emphasis. Then she let the observation settle in the room as one sets down a cup with care, without sound, without disturbance. The silence that followed lasted perhaps 10 seconds. It was a particular kind of silence, not uncomfortable, not the silence of something having gone wrong. Rather, the silence of a person absorbing what has been said and deciding in real time how to receive it. When Mrs. Grant spoke, her voice was very even. That is a comforting thought. "I have found it so," Miss Marple said pleasantly. Then, with complete naturalness, she moved the conversation to the apple jelly she'd been making from her own garden's windfalls. The yield had produced rather more than she could reasonably use, and she intended to divide it among several people, including Mrs. Grant if she would accept a jar. Mrs. Grant said she would be very glad of it. Nothing further was said. Nothing further needed to be said. The thing that had needed to pass between them had passed in the only form in which it could usefully be received, not as accusation, not as negotiation, not as anything requiring acknowledgement, confession, or reply. Miss Marple had made clear in the only way available to her that she understood something of what had driven the events of the past weeks. She had made clear that the fear at the root of those events was unnecessary. And she had made equally clear that the confidence originally shared remained where it had always been. She had done all this without once requiring Mrs. Grant to admit to anything. It was, Miss Marple thought, as near to a resolution as the circumstances permitted, and more than most situations of this kind achieved. She stayed for another 20 minutes. They spoke about the apple jelly, a book Mrs. Grant had recently finished, and the reading circle's next selection, which had at last been agreed upon, and which Mrs. Grant thought she would enjoy. When Miss Marple rose to leave, Mrs. Grant accompanied her to the door with a warmth that was, for the first time in several weeks, entirely unguarded. In the hallway, the silver-frame photograph stood where it had always stood. Neither of them looked at it. Neither of them looked away from it. Miss Marple said good morning with genuine friendliness and went out into the October day. It was bright, cool, and clean, with the kind of light that comes after a period of grey weather and seems particularly clear by contrast. The change, when it came quietly. Miss Marple had expected that it would. Such things did not reverse themselves overnight any more than they had established themselves overnight. They shifted gradually, through the same mechanisms by which they had been created, not by announcement, but by the slow adjustment of social temperature as the current that had been directing it changed course. She noticed it first in Mrs. Clement, who called at Bramblewood Cottage on the Thursday of that week, on the pretext of asking about Miss Marple's recipe for quince cheese, which she had admired some weeks previously. The visit was warm in the unqualified way Mrs. Clement's visits had been warm before. She stayed rather longer than strictly necessary for the purpose of the recipe, and she talked with her usual ease and pleasure. There was none of the slight deliberateness that had been present in Miss Weatherby's parlour. Miss Pritchard, encountered on the lane the following Saturday, was her usual precise and interested self. The quality of her interest had returned to its proper object, the world at large, rather than Miss Marple's conduct within it. Mrs. Harrington Doyle sent a note the following week. It did not apologise. That was not Mrs. Harrington Doyle's manner, but it suggested warmly that they should arrange something before the end of autumn, perhaps a small dinner, if Miss Marple was free. Mrs. Harrington Doyle hoped she was. Miss Marple was free and said so. The Reading Circle's November gathering took place at Miss Pritchard's house. Miss Marple attended, and her piece of cake was cut with the same casual generosity as everyone else's. When she said something during the discussion that caused several people to pause and reconsider, they paused and reconsidered with the comfortable attentiveness of people among whom she belonged. It was on a Saturday afternoon in late October, with a low autumn sun making long shadows across the garden, and the last of the roses giving their final account of themselves against the east wall, that Dolly Bantry came to tea and said it was almost unfair. "And I hope, Jane, that you know you were right throughout." "It was not a matter of being right," Miss Marple said, with the mildness of someone who had considered a thing carefully enough to be certain of its proportions. "It was a matter of understanding what had happened and why. The two are rather different." "I think you let her off rather lightly," Dolly said, in the tone of a person whose sense of justice had not been fully satisfied. "Perhaps," Miss Marple said. "But I was not looking for a reckoning. I was looking for a resolution. They are not reached by the same road." She poured more tea. Outside, the apricot climber shifted slightly in the evening breeze. Its last two blooms were still holding on against all reasonable expectation. "People are rarely as brave as they appear," Miss Marple said, with the thoughtful quietness of someone returning to a reflection that had been with her for some time, and often far more anxious. "It is best to remember that, and to be kind where one can." Dolly was quiet for a moment, in the way she became quiet when she had heard something she thought true, and was giving it the consideration it deserved. "You're really very good, Jane," she said presently. "I am very old," Miss Marple replied with a small smile. "It is not at all the same thing, but it is occasionally useful." The fire crackled once and settled. The room gathered the last of the afternoon light into itself with the quiet contentment of a place returned, at last, to what it had always been meant to be.